I would get so many people that always have this idea that like, I'm boring, I'm basic, I'm vanilla. And whenever vanilla came up as sort of a pejorative term, I would pull out my cookbook. And I would tell them there are like 5,000 recipes in here. I dare you to go through and find one that doesn't require vanilla. Right?
Yes. Welcome to Sleeping Around, where we offer a peek behind the curtain of modern sex and relationship therapy and research, bringing you insights and conversations otherwise reserved for the therapy room. I'm your host, Elena Joy, a Master's of Counseling Psychology student, content creator, and lifelong sex and relationship nerd. Enjoy the episode. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Sleeping Around. Today's topic is long awaited. We are joined today with Dr. Stefani Goerlich, a certified sex therapist and licensed clinical social worker who specializes in working with gender, sexuality, and relationship differences. Stefani is the multi-award-winning author of 5 books on BDSM, kink, and mental health, and co-host of the popular Securing Sexuality podcast, which is currently on hiatus. She's also currently pursuing her second PhD in social work, with her research focusing on conceptualizations of deviance, particularly in forensic contexts. And we talk all things kink. What is kink? What is BDSM? What isn't kink and BDSM? What does it mean to be vanilla? And is that okay? And importantly, we talk about red flags as well as green flags to look out for when looking to explore BDSM and or kink. We talk about how to start exploring for yourself and how to bring it up with a partner. Stefani is an obvious expert in this area, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. So how about just start by telling us a little bit about you, what got you into sexology, kink-affirming therapy?
My background, by training, I'm a clinical social worker. And my background for the maybe first decade or so of my career, 10, 15 years, was domestic violence, sexual assault survivor advocacy. So I was a domestic violence therapist. I was a first response advocate, meaning that I was with survivors in the first hours after a sexual assault. I was a pediatric first response advocate, which is a whole other ball of wax. And I really spent a lot of time helping people who had had their bodies and their relationships and their sexuality weaponized against them. And, as one can imagine, over time, that wears you down. And I wanted to do something a little bit different, but I wanted to stay in that same sort of wheelhouse. So I went back and I did my postgraduate training in sex therapy. And when somebody is training to become a therapist, one of the first things we have to do is this thing called a SAR, a sexual attitudes reassessment. And you're exposed to a lot of different relationship styles, a lot of different sexuality and sexual practices. And it was really interesting because in my program, we did that first. It was the first thing you did as you're meeting as a group, as you're learning about the field. And so I'm sitting in this room with, 50 or so strangers, and we're watching videos of older adults who can't have penetrative sex anymore, but they're touching and they're holding each other and they're caressing. And people are saying, "Oh, that's so beautiful. I hope my partner and I are like that when we are old." And we watch, documentaries with people with some pretty significant disabilities who have sex workers that help them maintain an active, physical and erotic life. And everybody around me is saying, "Oh, that's so brave. That's so admirable. We really need to rethink public policy." And then we got to the 90 or so minutes we got on kink, and the energy in the room completely changed. And it got very whispery, and it got very giggly, and people started cracking jokes. And I realized that, even in a group of fully licensed health professionals who have self-selected into sex therapy, who then chose a very well-known progressive program, this is still a problem. And so I actually started writing The Leather Couch maybe 2 days into my sex therapy training.
Yeah.
And I wrote the book as I went through the program because I realized that even among people who think they're really informed and really progressive and really just cool and with it, this is a significant bias. And so, I've always been somebody who advocates for people who are having their relationships and their sexuality weaponized against them. And
Mhm.
that's still very much true for erotic minorities like our kinky folks. And so I've been doing it ever since. It's the same work I've always done, it's just a slight twist on the theme.
Let's talk about BDSM for a newcomer, for a beginner. What even is it? What does it stand for? What do the different letters mean?
So BDSM is one of my favorite initialisms because it's actually like three separate initialisms in a trench coat, right? It's a Swiss Army knife sort of acronym because they do double duty, right? We have B&D, which is bondage and discipline. So bondage and discipline, when I'm explaining it, I explain as it's exchange of control. So that can mean control of movement, control of speech, control of behavior. That's where we get our handcuffs and our ropes and our straitjackets. It's also where we get things like protocol and rituals and daily routines, rules. If you were to tell me that the only way you would continue the interview is if I stood in the corner and faced a wall for the rest of the time that we were talking, that would be an exchange of control because
Uh-huh.
you're putting a restriction on my movement and I am consenting to restrict my movement at your request. So, exchange of control. Then we have DNS or DS, so dominance and submission. This is what most people think of when they think of BDSM. And it can get a little blurry because dominance and submission is an exchange of authority. So we have control and we have authority, and those sound like synonyms, but really what we're talking about here is decision-making power, right? Like who has the final say when a conflict arises? Who is making decisions in the relationship? What are they making decisions around? And that can vary. That can be time boxed to only the bedroom or only every third Saturday when we feel like it. It can also be a 24/7 lifestyle dynamic. It can be limited to specific themes, like maybe I'm a submissive and my partner lays out my clothes for me every day. They have the authority over what I wear. It could be that I'm a dominant and I delegate all of the financial tasks to my submissive. So it's who has decision-making power, which does tie in nicely with control, right? If you're telling me I have to stand in the corner, that is an act of authority that manifests as control. But they can happen totally separately.
Ah, right. So control is more action oriented, whereas authority is more, like you said, decision making. It's almost more abstract in a way.
You might think of it as internal versus external,
Ah, okay.
right? Like
Mm-hmm.
external behaviors that we're controlling might be controlled because of the internal process of authority exchange. They don't
Mm,
have to be, but they often go together that way. And then
right.
our last piece is SM, sadism and masochism. Often squished together as sadomasochism, which makes a lot of sense because usually people that like one half also enjoy the other half. And, culturally, we tend to think about this as pain, and that can be very scary and very intimidating for people. They're giving pain, they're receiving pain. But pain is a very culturally sort of subjective idea, and it
Hmm.
carries a lot of values judgments with us. So I usually describe sadomasochism as an exchange of sensation. It can be really,
Ah,
really intense sensation. It might be sensation that you would not personally want to receive for yourself, but it may or may not be painful, right? If somebody's being tickled to the point of tears, that's definitely intense sensation. And it might be uncomfortable in a way that feels fun for the masochist. But is it
mm-hmm.
painful necessarily? Pain
Mm.
is subjective. And we tend to think about pain, especially in America and especially in the West, as something bad. We want to avoid pain, we want to treat pain, we want to mitigate pain. We don't have a lot of ideas of good pain. Maybe childbirth,
Mm.
maybe professional sports, right? Like endurance sports or ballet, endurance arts. But
Mm-hmm.
generally
Running a
speaking,
marathon.
yes, exactly. So the ideas of good pain are so limited for us culturally that for me, when I'm talking about it, it's easier just to remove that idea and to talk about sensation because it becomes much more expansive and also a little bit more values neutral as we're thinking about it.
It's interesting that most of the examples that you just gave for each part of the acronym are not inherently sexual.
Yeah.
Whereas BDSM is most often thought of in a sexual context. But I have the feeling you're about to tell me that there is a much wider, more expansive world of BDSM out there. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
If I sold t-shirts, if there was one thing that people hear me say like a broken record, it is that BDSM and kink are always relational. They are only sometimes sexual. You can tie yourself up in rope because you like the way it feels, because it gives you a squeezy, held, almost swaddle-like comforting sensation. You don't need another person for that, and you don't need to be aroused for that. You could tell me to stand in a corner because that's the hierarchy that we've negotiated in this podcast. And that might have nothing to do with our sexual relationship or lack thereof. And I might really enjoy giving and receiving intense sensation because I really like the dopamine hit. I really love the endorphins. I like the way my body physiologically responds to intense sensation. And that could be sexualized, but it doesn't have to be sexual in order for me to enjoy it.
Then where do you draw the line of like what is considered BDSM? Like as you're describing the different sorts of power dynamics or authority or control or sensation seeking, I'm thinking of, riding a roller coaster. And that maybe it's not relational, but it's a kind of an intense sensation seeking behavior. Or I'm thinking of a teacher-student relationship, like let's say in university or college. The professor has an authority. They have a decision-making power over the student. But those things aren't BDSM. In this definition, how do you define what is or isn't, would or wouldn't be classified as BDSM?
So we come back to that relational piece, right? It has to be consensual. It has to be negotiated. The classic trope of like teacher and student is one that we see sexualized in so many movies and porn and all sorts of things. But what makes that an appropriate idea versus an inappropriate idea, the sexualization of that relationship, is the consensuality piece of it, right? The mutuality, the reciprocity of it.
Yes.
If I'm the teacher and I am crushing on one of my students, that's actually probably a violation of university policy. There's no like clause in the syllabus that carves out the place where we can start to flirt with each other in class. Right? It's the intentionality, the reciprocity, and the consent around it that takes something from everyday sensation seeking or everyday sort of power dynamics into something that's much more intentional and is meant to be relational.
Right. So I'm imagining a person who's interested maybe in one of these aspects or all of these aspects of BDSM, and they're in a relationship. The first important piece is consent, obviously, but even taking a step backward, how might somebody approach this curiosity with a partner? How might somebody bring this to a partner? What's your beginner's guide to BDSM?
I mean, I wrote a whole book about it, so it's going to be hard to sum up in a word
Linked
or two.
in the show notes, linked in the description. It's there for anyone who's interested.
A part of it, I usually say that the easiest way to introduce the idea is to externalize it a little bit. Bring in, and I don't mean porn, could be porn depending upon your relationship, but usually I recommend not starting with porn. Bring in something that has the themes that you would like to explore with your partner. Find a movie, find a podcast, find a sexy book, and introduce that. And then have a conversation about that. Watch it together, read it together, and ask your partner what they think, what they like, what they don't like, what makes them curious, what turns them off. Because that way, you kind of have the safe distance, right? If you introduce an idea and your partner's like, oh my God, absolutely not, I would never. You haven't immediately made it about you. At this point, you're not necessarily being rejected. The ideas in the movie are, or the themes in the book are. And so that can feel like a safe way to introduce a topic. And then, I mean, it's honestly pretty rare that happens. It does. There are some people that are just like, not in my wheelhouse, never going to be a yes for me. For most people, it tends to look like Well, I mean, I wouldn't want to do it that way, but there are some things in there
Mm,
that I could see being interesting. And
right.
now you've opened up the door to a conversation, and now you're starting to think about, well, what did you see that you liked? Or what were the things that made you curious? And then it becomes, well, what would it look like if we explored that? Or, is that a curiosity you've wanted to act on? And so you can take it from sort of this third party other thing into, well, what could we do? Or would you ever want to? But I have found that using sort of that pop culture or that media point of entry feels really safe and comfortable for people. Because if for some reason they get a really adamant no, they're saying no to a movie or to a book and not to you. And then maybe, we revisit the conversation and we try a different approach.
You're inviting collaboration in a way that feels less loaded, maybe, than if you were bringing an interest to a partner and saying, this is something that I want or that I'm curious about. What do you think? It's more of, yeah, like you said, dissecting a book or dissecting a movie. And just in you explaining that, the way you describe it, it feels like there's room for exploration, even just in a conversation between two people.
Yeah, we don't want anybody to feel pressured. We don't want anybody to feel like they have to do X, Y, or Z or else. And so starting from a place of what do you think about what they're doing over there isn't starting with an ask, right? It's starting with an idea, which is a conversation starter, but it's not the same pressure as going immediately to an ask. And so that can, to your point, that can start a conversation. And now we're collaborating and now we're brainstorming and now we're building something together. Instead of, and this is a pitfall for some of the kinky people that I work with, instead of presenting an entirely nuanced, incredibly detailed, fleshed out fantasy to your partner and going, you in?
Yes.
Very rarely are they in, because something that you've had a lot of time to build in your mind isn't necessarily what they would want. And so starting with that sort of externalized piece lets you build something together.
Yes. So you also mentioned not necessarily porn, right? And maybe let's not bring the heavy hitters in from day one. And that brings me to kind of another entry point conversation or question around what we see portrayed as BDSM or as kink, whether it's in porn or in media like 50 Shades of Grey, the classics, for better or for worse.
50 Shades is now the classic.
It's just such a poor representation in every way. If those are the images that come to mind when somebody thinks about BDSM, could you give some examples of actual beginner first step kind of entry point BDSM areas of play or ideas? Like, what can BDSM actually look like outside of the more extreme versions, which we can get to, but as a starting point?
So a lot of the couples that come to me struggle because one person wants their partner to be more dominant. They really want to have that submissive headspace for themselves. And their partner is just like, I don't know. It can feel really difficult to just be like, okay, you, authority holder, now go. People struggle with that.
Yeah.
So, I really recommend starting with some really simple things. And it depends on what you're looking for, right? That control versus authority versus sensation. Sensation is almost the easiest, especially if we already have an active sex life with our partner. Because it just means bringing in maybe a little bit rougher touch, right? Or some new toys. Like, you don't have to be the one giving intense sensation. There are vehicles that will help you deliver that for your partner. Where people get hung up is on that control and on that authority piece. And so when somebody says, I really want my partner to dominate me, which is probably the most common request I get, I encourage them to start with baby steps, right? Start with things like choosing underwear, laying up, I'm going to choose your tie every day. I'm going to choose your panties every day. Something that's subtle, but something that conveys that feeling of authority, that is something that more submissive partner can carry with them throughout the day. Like, every time they use a restroom or look in a mirror, they're like, oh, she picked my tie. I'm wearing this because she chose it. Right. And it gives that submissive feeling. It creates that headspace that they want without necessarily asking a lot from a partner that might not have expected to be asked to take on a dominant role.
Right.
Another really easy thing can be like a symbolic piece of jewelry, a bracelet, an anklet, a ring. Those are non-gendered items. Anybody can use those. The act of putting that on every day, or of your partner putting it on for you. Before they leave the house, they put this
Mm.
bracelet on you. You wear it all day, and it makes you
Hmm.
feel that submissive sort of own piece, but it's an easy thing for them to do, and we're not asking them to take on this huge amount of authority exchange right off the bat. For some people, it might be like a redivision of household labor or a redivision of tasks. Maybe a way to create a submissive headspace is my partner puts me on an allowance, or I put my partner on an allowance, right? I'm going to handle all of the expenses. You get $400 a month. That is your money. At the end of the month, I want you to submit a report telling me what you used it on.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody really wants to feel that's ongoing daily submission, that can be a nice way to create it. And then as you start with those little things, it becomes easier then for the person that's being asked to take on a dominant role to start thinking of other ways to do that and to expand outward from there. Choosing your partner's meals at a restaurant is a really easy way to take on a dominant role in that moment. They will have this. You don't have to necessarily feel like a born dominant in order to do these little things that create that space for your partner. And if you're the person that all of a sudden has a partner who's saying, I've always wanted to be in a DS relationship, and I really wish that you were more submissive. Those are also ways to scratch that itch for them that don't necessarily feel controlling or intrusive to you. So those little things, those small gestures that carry a lot of symbolic weight for the kinkier partner are a really great way to get started.
I love those because a lot of the questions that I get, like I ask my audience questions for an expert in BDSM, and a lot of the questions are around either how do I start or even how do I know if this is something I would like? And what you're describing almost holds or serves both of those purposes. It can be an entry point and it can also be an exploration.
And it's okay if you don't like something. I think one of the more difficult things about living in a culture that's moving towards a more sex positive mindset, but also has a lot of purity culture still ingrained in it, is this idea that if I don't like something, that something's wrong with me. Like I'm kink shaming, or I'm not open-minded enough. And I think it's really important to hold space for no, right? Like the fact that something didn't work for you, or the fact that you're just not into something, is not a comment on you as a person. It doesn't mean that you're kink shaming your partner. It doesn't mean that you're not open-minded. It doesn't mean that you're boring. It just means that we try something else, right? Because everybody likes something.
Right.
It's just a matter of being playful and maintaining this idea of experimentation and curiosity, instead of getting hung up on, well, I tried picking their tie and it made me feel really stupid and weird, and we stopped it after a month, and I guess that means I'm just boring and vanilla.
Yeah.
Right? Like it doesn't need to go down that road, but I think culturally that's where we are. Either you're super cool and sex positive, or you're not. And really there's a lot more gray space than that.
Or would you use the word vanilla?
So back in the before times, before COVID, when I had a bricks and mortar office, I actually kept the King Arthur cookie cookbook in my office because I would get so many people, both, on their own and with couples, partners in a couple, that would really beat themselves up because they just didn't like something, or they just couldn't get to where their partner was. And they always had this idea that, like, I'm boring, I'm basic, I'm vanilla, I'm so lame. And whenever vanilla came up as sort of a pejorative term, I would pull out my cookbook and I would tell them, there are like 5,000 recipes in here. I dare you to go through and find one that doesn't require vanilla, right?
Yes. That is, can I steal that for my future clients? Like that's so good. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, there are 5,000 variations on how to make something yummy, but all of them start with what we think of as vanilla sex, right? Or a vanilla relationship. When we talk about vanilla, what do we mean? We mean it's loving, it's respectful, it's collaborative, it's reciprocal, it's egalitarian. It has, we have each other's backs.
Mm-hmm.
That's not kinky. Healthy kink dynamics all have that too. They're the recipes that we add, almonds and orange zest and nuts and chocolate and coconut and I don't know what else. But they all need that foundation of mutual love, mutual respect, mutual regard. So being vanilla is not the absence of something. Vanilla is whole and
Ooh,
complete in and of itself. Vanilla
right.
also gives us an opportunity to enhance and explore and expand. That's part of why I called my book for couples with sprinkles on top, is because I don't
Yes.
actually want anybody to change their essential nature. I just want them to be open to the idea of enhancing their essential nature.
What a beautiful reframe. Thank you for that. For all of the folks listening at home who are thinking, well, I'm listening to these episodes because I'm interested, but man, am I boring in
Nobody's
comparison.
boring. Nobody's
No.
boring. I think a lot a haven't been given an opportunity to really explore themselves and really
Hmm.
think deeply about what they like and what they don't. Our sex ed process, assuming you even get it, I teach a graduate class in sexual trauma. And their assignment for my students this week is to research the sex ed standards in their states. And their eyes are being opened to how shockingly diverse those standards are. So, assuming we even get sex ed in school, we're taught a very linear, very sort of goal oriented reproductive model. We're not taught about pleasure. We're not taught about fantasy. We're not taught about variations on the theme of reproduction. And so, the one advantage that my kinky clients have over their vanilla partners is that kinky people tend to have spent a lot of time thinking very, very deeply and in great detail about what turns them on and why. And
Hmm.
vanilla people, or just really everyday people, aren't really given the opportunity to do that or the permission to do that. So it's not that anybody is boring, it's that often we just haven't really had the chance or the opportunity or the vocabulary to think about what we would like if we thought about what we liked at all.
Yes, this is tying into so many things that I've talked about on this show and just in my content over the years. Just the idea of if you're not outside of kind of compulsory heterosexuality or heteronormativity, the kind of cookie cutter direction we're all set in. We're born, we are given a gender, and like, here's your road. If you deviate from that road in any way, it takes this level of self reflection and exploration and work to pursue a different path. If you
Mm-hmm.
do kind of fit in the road, even in small ways, there isn't a lot of opportunity or a lot of driving force to offer you the potentially incredible menu of things that are out there. And so that's another piece that I love in what you're saying, especially around the kind of those intro level pieces you gave, is like, that's something that anybody, whether they self-identify as kinky or not, might go, oh, I could try that.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds fun. Like, let me see. And maybe somebody discovers something about themselves that they didn't know was there. And how beautiful is that?
100%. That's part of why I actually say when you're introducing the idea, stay away from porn. Because we're
Yes.
not really given the chance to build an erotic vocabulary as people. It's not a part of our health curriculum. And so starting with the way Cosmopolitan and Women's Health magazine talk about sex and intimacy, and then maybe building to, the romance novel layer of sexuality. We have to build up to the more explicit, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form anti-porn. It's just, it can be too much for somebody that doesn't have the words already to describe what they want.
Mhm.
And so starting out with the more, mass market mainstream things and building into the more explicit portrayals can feel more comfortable. And it lets them kind of build their own word base and their own sort of language for what they want before they just get this fire hose of very specific BDSM content.
So, how about some examples or ideas around entry level ways to bring BDSM into a sexual context? If we've kind of talked about authority, control, sensation more broadly, I'm like inspired by your day-to-day ideas. I'm like, do you have any suggestions or tips for a sexual
I mean,
context?
yeah, a lot of it carries over, right? If you've been choosing your partner's tie every day, switch to choosing their lingerie. especially if your partner is male. It kind of subverts the expected norm, right? If they come home and there's a pair of silky boxers laying on the bed, and most people don't know what to do with that. And silky boxers are not particularly kinky, but because we're playing with sort of the gendered expectations, it can feel really kinky. If you know that you like control, if you've been playing with rules and rituals, creating rituals around sex and intimacy could be interesting, right? Starting with, you're going to go and take a shower, or we're going to take a shower together and you are going to bathe me. Things like that again, aren't necessarily intrinsically sexual. I'm not describing a really complicated sex position here. But what we're doing is we're taking those everyday things and we're just intensifying them a little bit, right? We're removing the clothing or we're changing the setting. If you've been playing around with restriction of movement, with things like handcuffs, like the cliche of the pink fuzzy handcuffs that you win as the door prize at the bachelorette party is a perfectly adequate place to start. But you can also use ties, like neckties, to bind your partner's wrist. You can use a belt and wrap the belt around their wrist. You don't have to spend a lot of money. The one thing I would say is spend a little bit of time, right? If you want to play around with restricting your partner's movement, spend some time online learning how to do that safely, because nerves exist and circulation is important. And so what you don't want to do is have your partner be pulled out of a sexy moment that you guys have both been anticipating and building towards because their hand goes numb, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of times people feel like they need to build this entire collection of kink paraphernalia before they can do anything. And that's really not necessary, but spending 15, 20 minutes ahead of time doing some basic safety research or some skill building research. How do you tie a knot if you're actually going to experiment with rope? What is a safe knot to use? That information is really easy to find online. We're not asking you to turn into Eagle Scout level knot tire, but knowing how to do a basic tie 20-minute YouTube video will A, help you feel a lot more confident. B, you'll feel more relaxed and your partner will feel more relaxed because they both know you're doing it safely. So you're removing sort of one of those barriers to pleasure. And then C, you get to walk in feeling confident. And if what you're trying to be is the more dominant person in that moment, the confidence is really key. So, if somebody's saying, I really wish that I could just let go in the bedroom and that you would just take total control, you don't need a lot of tools. But if you spend a little bit of time getting the skill building education, the confidence that you feel is going to be 90% of their experience of dominance and submission.
In what you're saying around preparation and the increase in confidence that comes with preparation, how about also the conversations, or you've mentioned negotiation? What pieces are important there? Because I can also imagine that having that conversation ahead of time or multiple ongoing conversations around consent and do's and don'ts and what we like and what we don't like would also increase confidence in the way that you're entering into a situation that your partner is excited about and that you're excited about.
So I am going to give a shout out to one of my favorite kink educators, who is Midori. Midori does fabulous work around how to have those conversations and how to ask good questions. And the thing that she emphasizes is asking, what would getting it right look like, right? How will I know when you're turned on? How will your body move? What will your face look like? What sort of noises do you make when you're turned on? And then conversely, how will I know when you're not? How will I know when things have gone sideways, when you're not feeling it, or when you're uncomfortable or unhappy? Because in the moment, we want to be fully present and we want to read our partner's cues. But when we're playing with these sorts of themes, the cues can become confusing, right? That's why we use safe words that aren't the words stop or no. Because those tend to be defaults, and often people say, no, stop, and they don't mean it at all. They're like, why'd you stop? Yeah. That's why we have pineapple or red. So being really clear up front and having some really fun, flirty, curious conversations. How will I know without words what good looks like, what sexy looks like, what pleasure feels like? How will I know when you're not having a good time, when you're not experiencing pleasure? Again, that comes back to that competence, which gives us the confidence that makes things have a more flow and feel better for everybody. So 100% stealing Midori's advice there, but I will give credit where credit is due. And I think it's a really, really important thing to do that a lot of us don't talk about, right? We'll talk about, well, what do you want to do? Oh, I really like impact play. Oh, so do I. Awesome. Let's do impact play. Cool. But if you're thinking about, like a bamboo cane and I'm picturing like some gentle open-handed smacks, we're going to have a bad time. But also, we thought we were on the same page. We both knew we liked impact play. So getting more detailed about it. What kind of impact play? What do you like about it? What sort of sensation? Do you like it when it's more thuddy or when it's more stingy? How will I know when you're enjoying the sting versus when it's become too much sting? And really, like, what does your face look like? What does good pain feel like for you? What does bad pain feel like for you? And having conversations that are much more detailed than we might think to ask, but that can still be sexy and can still be foreplay.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that these conversations can be foreplay. They can be a positive, fun, exciting, playful part of the experience. It doesn't need to be this kind of separate, clinical, detached sort of piece. Early on in our conversation, you mentioned that kind of your background is in trauma work. Is there a connection between somebody who's experienced trauma and somebody who's interested in BDSM? And the flip side of that, or the other side of the coin sort of, is how do you know that BDSM is not just another form of abuse or a form of inflicting trauma? Does that am I asking the questions in a way that makes sense?
It does. And those are big questions. I will tell you, I give whole lectures, right? I could spend...
I believe that.
I'm giving an 8-hour talk on the abuse piece this fall. So answering this quickly is going to be tricky, but I will try. Let's talk about the connection between kink and trauma first, because I think one of the biggest misconceptions about kinky people is that they are kinky because they are somehow or in some way like reenacting trauma, right?
Yeah.
People are kinky because they were damaged in some way and now they have damaged sex and damaged relationships. Probably the most common myth about kink. And it really is rooted in kink stigma and a lot of shame and a lot of bias and bigotry. And I'm going to call that out for what it is. The fact that somebody does something that you wouldn't personally want for yourself does not mean there's anything wrong with them. And it is okay for you to not want that, but not okay for you to judge the people that do.
Louder for the people in the back.
But also, we don't always think about our judgments, right? A lot of our biases and our blind spots, they feel intuitively correct. Like, most of us that have bigotries, we rationalize our bigotries. We think they're grounded in something objective. We're not biased. We're just accurate. So the thing I will say is that the research actually just simply does not bear this out. They have done studies and asked kinky people about their childhoods and about their histories. And kinky people do not actually report having trauma histories at a rate that is higher than the general population. Kinky people and non-kinky people tend to have trauma histories about the same percentage. What is interesting is that kinky people tend to have a PTSD diagnosis more often than their vanilla peers. I used to say this makes sense because there is an argument to be made that some people use BDSM and kink as sort of a form of cathartic play. And that maybe the reason why we see kinky people have not more trauma than vanilla people, but more intense diagnoses is because they're using their BDSM play as a form of self-care, as a form of self-healing, right? That's sort of, in mental health, we talk about sort of like the trauma-focused CBT, right? You tell your story over and over again until it loses the sting. Maybe there's something of that happening. That was my working theory for a long time. And then Alyssa Helfer and I were writing the basics together. And we were having this conversation, and she looked at me and she goes, or it's another example of kink stigma. And I said, tell me more. And she said, we don't actually know that that's what's happening. We also don't know that kinky people aren't sharing the same stories and the same histories that their vanilla peers are, but that the clinicians have that bias of kink equals broken. And they're like, oh, well, this is because you have trauma. It is PTSD. She goes, we don't know that they're not getting a more intense diagnosis because they're kinky. It could be kink stigma. So a little bit of foreshadowing, that question is my research white whale. And in my academic work, that is what I'm hoping to answer. I'm going to solve the chicken and egg dilemma in the next 5 years. Publication forthcoming.
Oh my God, I can't wait to read it.
But it's a really important thing to know. The most important thing that people need to understand is that kinky people have not been traumatized more often than vanilla people.
Everything that you're saying is reminding me also of kind of the past pathologization of queerness and the stigma that, I mean, it still exists, but the stigma from back in the day that being queer was some sort of mental illness, exactly like you're saying, it was this result of trauma. And it's so interesting to hear how kink and BDSM are kind of following this same trajectory, as it starts as something that's not understood and so therefore is pathologized. And now, as we're actually looking at it and doing the research, we're finding, oh, this is just another form of sexuality, another form of expression, like anything else, right?
Yes. I talk about this a lot, as we've said, and I have a whole other talk that I do on sort of the parallel path and the intersection of queer history and queer culture and kink history and kink culture. You know, every year there's the recurring conversation of, does kink belong at Pride?
Yes,
right?
yes.
So part of it is respectability politics. And a part of it is, what does it mean to be an insider versus an outsider? And when a group moves from the margins to the mainstream, what do they do to protect themselves and to feel safe? But also, just historically, the answer is yes. The answer is that the pathologization of being queer, of being gay, being lesbian, being bisexual, being trans, has always been mirrored with the pathologization of kink.
Yeah.
Legally, clinically, diagnostically, the experiences going back hundreds of years are the same. I have a giant tattoo of Magnus Hirschfeld on my leg. And he is not only the father of modern sexology, he developed couples counseling, he developed queer affirming therapy, he developed trans affirming therapy, and the thing that people forget about is he also developed kink affirming therapy. You know, his archives and his library, what wasn't burned by the Nazis, contain his studies of like adolescents and young people that were having sadomasochistic fantasies. You know, if we go back to the beginning origins of the study of sexology, and the minute people started caring about the idea of who somebody is sexually and what their mental health looks like, queer people and kinky people have been centered in that and treated roughly the same the entire time. So does kink belong at Pride? Yes, absolutely. But also, it's really important to recognize that queer communities have made progress that kinky communities have not, which is not to undermine the loss of progress that we're experiencing right now, right? Like, every marginalized community is under attack right now. And to say that some erotic outsiders have been left outside when others were welcomed in does not diminish the fact that the struggle for everybody is still ongoing.
I hate that that needs to be a disclaimer in the great old year of 2025. Who would have thought? Not me. Can you also speak to maybe some misconceptions around BDSM just being a sort of guise for abuse to take place?
I mean, on one hand, there are absolutely people in this world that use the language and philosophies of kink to exploit people. Also, that's true everywhere. There are people that use the language and philosophies of religion. There are people that use the language and philosophies of yoga. There are people that use the language and philosophies of therapy to abuse people. So we can acknowledge that that happens without saying, therefore, this entire thing is dangerous, bad, and wrong. Where there are human communities, there will be bad actors. So you had asked in the beginning, how do we parse out BDSM from just, power differentials or thrill seeking? And we can use that same sort of framework to parse out consensual kink from abuse. Because, what did I say in the beginning? It needs to be reciprocal. It needs to be intentional. It needs to be consensual. It needs to be negotiated. If you find yourself in a situation where it's not reciprocal, where somebody is telling you what's going to happen and they're not interested in your ideas about what could also happen, when it becomes unilateral, that's problematic.
Mm-hmm.
When you're setting boundaries and those boundaries are being violated, when it's no longer consensual, that's problematic. When it's not negotiated, and I see this a lot, where people will just sort of fall into patterns of abuse without really thinking about what's happening. And then it turns into, well, I mean, you liked it when I was rough in the bedroom. Or,
Oh,
well, you always said you wanted me to be more dominant, or you always said you wanted to play around with submission.
right.
It should never be something that we just stumble into. It should be intentional and negotiated. It comes back to, well, what does that look like? How will I know if you're having a good time? If your interests, if your perspective, if your desires are not being taken into consideration, and if your boundaries are being violated, it's not consensual kink. So reciprocity, intentionality, negotiation, and consent. That's how we
Yes.
tell when kink is happening. That's how we tell when kink is not happening.
That is such a nice, concise way to remember it and to check in, right? If you're kind of questioning, is what's happening right now or the dynamic that I'm in, is this consensual kink or is this something that feels a little bit different? The questions to ask yourself are what you just said. Are my desires being taken into account? Is this consensual? Is it intentional, reciprocal, and negotiated?
Yep.
Got it. Okay, so that's sort of talking about the red flags to look out for, ways to know how things are going. Do you have any green flags?
I think curiosity is huge. If somebody says, I have this idea, I have this thing, I've kind of always wanted to try, but I've been really nervous about mentioning it. If that's received with, oh, really? Tell me more. I'm curious.
Yeah.
What do you like about that? What about that turns you on? What would that look like if we tried it? Curiosity is huge. It doesn't need to turn into a yes, right? But being curious about the why and the what, as opposed to, no, thank you, I'm out. That's a green flag for me, right? And again, not putting any shame on the no's. People, no is sacred in my practice. You are always allowed to say no. I like it. I'm happiest when people are curious before setting their no. You can ask a lot of questions and you can be curious and supportive and still fall on the no side of things at the end. But I think a green flag is that curiosity. It's that, tell me more. I want to understand you better. Even if we never try this, I want to know what's in your head. I want to know what's in your heart. Enthusiasm is always great. Somebody that isn't just willing to try the thing because they know it will make you happy, but they can find something in that thing that they can get excited about too. And it's okay if those are two different things. I think often people think that they have to be on the same mental page in order to enjoy the same activity or the same practice. And that's not always true. I might hate the idea of being tied up. Not my thing at all. I really am not into the tying up thing. But what I am into is the having a really long day at work and being able to come home and just have a half hour where I'm not expected to do anything, fix anything, cook anything, go anywhere. And maybe if my partner's always wanted to experiment with bondage, and I'm not really there for the bondage piece, maybe the idea of them putting me in a straitjacket and throwing me on the bed for 20 minutes after work can be reframed into, I'm getting those 20 minutes where nothing is expected of me, where all I have to do is relax and be. And they get to put me in the street. They get the fun of feeling like they're exerting some control. They're getting the fun of the toys and the fancy and everything else. And maybe that's not what I get out of it. But if we can find something in those moments that we can each latch onto, then we can be enthusiastic about it, even if it's not necessarily something we would have thought we'd appreciate in the beginning.
It makes me think of the host of different reasons that people might engage in sex. For some folks, it's at times for orgasm. It can be for physical closeness. It can be for emotional intimacy. It can be for feeling wanted or for feeling vulnerable or whatever. There's so many different reasons, and the same could be said for kink practices or play of any kind. I love the emphasis on that the importance of the no being an option, because with the consent piece that we're talking about, if no isn't truly on the table as an option, there is no true consent. So
Yeah.
I like the emphasis on, even within curiosity, no is always possible.
Seeking more information is not the same as opening up a door.
Mm-hmm.
But seeking more information lets us be more nuanced about our no. You know, if you say, I'm really into bondage, and I say, I'm not, we're done.
Yeah.
You say, I'm really into bondage because I love the idea of knowing that there's somebody in my bedroom just tied up and waiting for me. And all of a sudden I'm like, I could get behind a 20-minute nap.
Yes.
And then it becomes, okay, not an immediate no, but what would you want that to look like? And you're like, well, I, have this fantasy of like taking ropes and they're spread eagle tied to the posts of the bed. I'm like, no.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still open to the idea of a 20-minute nap where you get to fantasize that I'm captive in the bedroom. So, let's take ropes out of it. But what else? What else? What if, the other thing that's always been kind of hot for me is I've always kind of wanted to play with a straitjacket a little bit. Like, it's crazy, right? Like, who has a straitjacket? But I found one online, and weirdly, you can get straitjackets on Amazon. Mm. And I mean, who would have known? But I mean, it would be kind of fun. But I mean, it's a little out there, and I'm going, all right, well, I really don't want to be spread eagle to anything. I want to be able to, like, move a little bit. I want to be able to shift my body around. Mm-hmm. I mean, I could probably try that. That seems like... That avoids some of my no's. It's a little bit more comfortable for me. Okay, but one thing I would not want is, if I'm going to be restrained in any way, I would need to still be able to see and hear. I don't want to feel like I'm cut off from everything. So I am happy to take a 20-minute nap while you fantasize about me being your prisoner in the bedroom. But absolutely no blindfolds. Absolutely no earplugs. I want to know that I still, if you're going to limit some of my movement, I want to know what's happening around me. Mm-hmm. We're still having a conversation around no's, but our no's are becoming more specific and more nuanced. And we're starting to find sort of the areas where we might be able to find some common ground, even if your kinky scene is my post-work nap.
Yes, and I love the inclusion of the language try. Like, this is also something you can have the conversation and then you can try it. And from there, continue to distill and decide and figure out, okay, well, I didn't like that. Well, what didn't I like about it? What did I like about it? Where can we go next? This kind of continuous, it's like you said, the continuous curiosity, the continuous collaboration. This is a wonderful piece of advice or a practice for anybody, kinky or not.
And don't underestimate the power of role play and imagination, right? Like, as kids, we're really, really good at being pirates for the 20 minutes of first recess and being like soldiers for the 20 minutes of second recess. And we have no uniforms or toys or anything but like a stick and some dirt in the playground. We can bring that back into adulthood too, right? Like, if you have your fantasy of the prisoner tied up in the bedroom, we don't necessarily actually have to start there. We can start with, I'm going to spend 20 minutes in the bedroom. I'm not going to come out. And you can have the fantasy of. Or maybe you just wrap me up in a blanket and like burrito me really tight. Mm-hmm. And it's nothing as, outre as a straitjacket. I am still restricted, but I can move if I need to. People often in adulthood feel like if we're not doing the real thing, we're not doing it at all, right? Like, we can have the fantasy of the straitjacketed captive or the spread eagle captive without actually putting our partner in that position. And sometimes what brings my kinkier people to therapy is this sort of all or nothing proposition. This, if I'm not getting the exact specific details of my most granular, longest running fantasy, they're just not doing enough for me. And we need to step back and recognize that no's and yeses can exist in lots of different ways, and that sometimes role play and fantasy can be where we start. And that's okay. It's not, again, a loss of anything. Mm-hmm. In the same way that I was a pirate in recess, you can be my prisoner in the bedroom, whether we have all the toys and gears or not.
I have one more question for you. If there was one thing you wish everybody knew about BDSM or about kink, what would it be?
That whatever it is you want, it's okay to want it. And that's true whether you're kinky or not. And that's true no matter what your kinks are. Not every fantasy is something that we can or should act on. Some of them are impossible. Some of them are illegal. A lot of space in between those 2 points. But the simple fact that it exists as a story in your head, that it is something that you think about, doesn't make it wrong, and it doesn't make you broken. That our thoughts and our fantasies are always okay. We sometimes have to, reality check behaviors, and there are social norms too, but the social norms are really wide and expansive. And the fact that you feel like what you want makes you weird or different or broken or unworthy or unwanted or undesirable, that doesn't have to be true. No matter what somebody is fantasizing about right now, I guarantee you I've met at least 3 other people with the same fantasy and could probably point you towards a community that shares it. Nobody is really alone in their desires, but we often feel really, really alone. And that's true for vanilla people too, right? Sometimes the world moves so fast and everything becomes so edgy that the people that are just not super edgy feel left behind. So if there was one thing I would want everybody to know, it's that you are absolutely perfectly okay exactly as you are. And that whatever is in your head is okay to be in your head.
Thank you so much for being here. Where can people find you if they want more?
So I'm not a huge social media person. I have an Instagram, but I mostly don't use it. My practice, I'm licensed in Michigan, Ohio, and Arizona. So my practice for clients is Bound Together Counseling. And then also my author page, and I do a lot of clinical consulting and expert witness work with attorneys. And that is just my name, StefaniGoerlich.com.
It will all be linked in the show notes. It'll all be linked in the description. We are now going to hop over to the Patreon extended version where I have some questions from the audience.
Okay.
But thank you for being here on the main channel.
So happy you had me. This was a really fun conversation.
Thanks for listening. You can also access all of our extended cut episodes with bonus content from every single guest over on Patreon at patreon.com/AlenaJoy. That's patreon.com/ALAYNAJoy. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at SleepingAroundPod for updates, teasers, episode discussions, and more. This episode was produced by Elena Joy and Danae Fender and edited by Corey Mosqueda. See you next time, back here on the couch.